Number 1. James Holmes. The Aurora Theater Massacre. On July 20th, 2012, the midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises at the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, transformed from an evening of entertainment into one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history when James Egan Holmes, a 24-year-old neuroscience graduate student, opened fire on the unsuspecting audience, killing 12 people and injuring 70 others in a meticulously planned attack that shocked the nation and raised profound questions about mental health, gun violence, and public safety. James Holmes had been a promising student at the University of Colorado's neuroscience doctoral program, having graduated with honors from the University of California, Riverside, but by early 2012, his academic performance had deteriorated significantly, with professors noting concerning changes in his behavior, including social withdrawal, poor hygiene, and failing grades that ultimately led to his withdrawal from the program in June of that year. In the months leading up to the massacre, Holmes began purchasing firearms legally, acquiring a Glock 22 handgun, a Remington Model 870 shotgun, a Smith & Wesson M&P15 semi-automatic rifle, and another Glock 22, along with over 6,000 rounds of ammunition purchased online, while simultaneously stockpiling tactical gear including body armor, a ballistic helmet, protective clothing for his legs, throat and groin, black tactical gloves, and a gas mask. Holmes also transformed his apartment into a death trap, rigging the entire living space with explosive devices, homemade grenades, gasoline-soaked carpets, and intricate triggering mechanisms designed to kill first responders and create a diversion from his planned theater attack, demonstrating a level of premeditation and technical sophistication that was both chilling and methodical. On the night of the attack, Holmes purchased a ticket for the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises at Theater 9, entered the auditorium with other moviegoers, and then propped open an emergency exit door before leaving the building and retrieving his weapons and tactical gear from his car parked directly outside that same exit. At approximately 12:38 in the morning, roughly 20 minutes into the film, Holmes re-entered the theater through the prop door, now fully dressed in black tactical clothing and body armor, and without warning or provocation, threw 2 canisters of tear gas into the crowd before systematically opening fire on the theater full of families, couples, and young people who had come to enjoy a movie. The shooting lasted only 90 seconds, but in that brief time, Holmes fired 76 rounds into the panicked crowd, methodically targeting victims as they scrambled for safety in the smoke-filled darkness, with some moviegoers initially believing the attack was part of the film's promotional experience before the horrifying reality became apparent. Among the 12 killed were Jessica Gauy, a 24-year-old aspiring sports journalist who had survived a shooting at a Toronto mall just weeks earlier, Jonathan Blunk, a 26-year-old Navy veteran who died shielding his girlfriend from bullets, Alexander Tevis, a 24-year-old who similarly protected his girlfriend, and 6-year-old Veronica Moser-Sullivan, the youngest victim, who had been attending the movie with her mother, who was paralyzed in the attack and suffered a miscarriage. When Holmes's rifle jammed, preventing even more casualties, he calmly exited the theater and walked to his car in the parking lot, where he was apprehended by Aurora police officers who arrived on scene within 90 seconds of the first 911 calls, finding him standing passively beside his vehicle, offering no resistance and alerting officers to the explosives in his apartment with the chilling statement, "I rigged my apartment to explode." The subsequent investigation revealed the extraordinary extent of Holmes's planning, with police and federal agents carefully dismantling the sophisticated booby traps in his apartment over a 2-day period, discovering that the explosives were designed with multiple redundant triggering mechanisms, including a tripwire connected to the apartment door, a remote control device, and a thermal trigger that would activate when the apartment reached a certain temperature, all configured to create a massive fireball that could have destroyed the entire building and killed numerous residents. Holmes's notebook, sent to his University of Colorado psychiatrist Dr. Lynn Fenton before the attack but not opened until after the massacre due to mail delays, contained detailed descriptions of his plans, including drawings of stick figures shooting other stick figures in a theater, calculations about how to kill the most people, philosophical musings about the value of human life, and questions about whether he should attack the airport, a movie theater, or another target. The legal proceedings that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Colorado history, with Holmes's defense team pursuing an insanity defense, arguing that their client suffered from severe mental illness including schizophrenia, and that his actions were the product of psychotic delusions rather than rational choice. While prosecutors presented evidence of his methodical planning, his lucid discussions with law enforcement, and expert testimony arguing that while Holmes may have been mentally ill, he understood the wrongfulness of his actions and could distinguish right from wrong under the legal definition of insanity. The trial, which began in April 2015 and lasted nearly 3 months, featured gut-wrenching testimony from survivors who described the terror of that night, family members who spoke about their lost loved ones, and detailed psychiatric evaluations from both prosecution and defense experts who offered starkly different assessments of Holmes's mental state. On July 16, 2015, after approximately 13 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Holmes guilty on all counts, including 24 counts of first-degree murder, 2 for each victim killed, and 140 counts of attempted murder, 2 for each person injured. The sentencing phase proved even more emotionally charged, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty while the defense argued for life imprisonment without parole, and after hearing impact statements from victims and their families, the jury deliberated for a full day before announcing on August 7, 2015, that they could not reach a unanimous decision required for a death sentence, automatically resulting in Holmes receiving 12 consecutive life sentences plus 3,318 years for the attempted murder convictions and other charges, ensuring he would never be released from prison. Holmes is currently incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, the federal Supermax prison, where he spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement with minimal human contact. The Aurora theater shooting sparked renewed national debates about gun control, mental health treatment, theater security, and the responsibility of universities and mental health professionals to intervene when students exhibit warning signs, while also highlighting the inadequacy of existing systems to prevent individuals experiencing mental health crises from legally purchasing arsenals of weapons and ammunition. The Century 16 Theater where the shooting occurred remained closed for 6 months following the attack and reopened in January 2013 after extensive remodeling, though Theater 9, where the massacre took place, was completely reconfigured and renumbered, and many survivors and victims' families have stated they could never return to the location. The case also raised important legal questions about the liability of online retailers who sold Holmes' weapons, ammunition, and tactical gear without any verification or red flags despite the unusually large quantities, and about the duty of mental health professionals to warn potential victims when patients make threats, though Holmes never explicitly told his psychiatrist about his specific plans to attack a theater. The emotional and physical toll on survivors has been profound and lasting, with many experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and physical disabilities from their injuries, while the families of those killed have had to navigate their grief in the public eye, with some becoming advocates for gun reform and others focusing on preserving the memories of their loved ones through charitable foundations and scholarships. The Aurora massacre remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in United States history and stands as a grim reminder of the devastating consequences when mental illness, easy access to weapons, and meticulous planning converge, while also demonstrating the courage and resilience of survivors, first responders, and a community that came together in the aftermath of unspeakable tragedy. Number 2. Jerry Sandusky. The Penn State child sex abuse scandal. The arrest and conviction of Jerry Sandusky, the former Penn State University assistant football coach, on 45 counts of child sexual abuse in 2012 exposed one of the most disturbing and far-reaching child predator cases in American sports history, revealing not only his decades-long pattern of sexually abusing young boys, but also a systematic institutional failure by university officials and legendary head coach Joe Paterno to report allegations and protect children, ultimately destroying Penn State's football program's reputation and leading to unprecedented NCAA sanctions against the university. Gerald Arthur Sandusky had been a beloved figure in Pennsylvania for decades, serving as Penn State's defensive coordinator under Joe Paterno from 1977 to 1999, helping the Nittany Lions win 2 national championships and developing a reputation as one of college football's finest defensive minds. But even more significantly, he had founded the Second Mile in 1977, a nonprofit organization ostensibly dedicated to helping at-risk and underprivileged children through sports, mentorship, and educational programs, which provided him with unfettered access to vulnerable boys from troubled backgrounds, many from single-parent homes or foster care, whom he systematically groomed and abused over more than 3 decades. The first official complaint against Sandusky came in 1998, when the mother of an 11-year-old boy reported to campus police that Sandusky had showered with her son in the Penn State locker room facilities, leading to an investigation by university police and the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare that included a sting operation where the mother confronted Sandusky in a recorded conversation during which he admitted to showering with the boy and apologized for his behavior, saying, "I understand, I was wrong. I wish I could get forgiveness. I know I won't get it from you. I wish I were dead." Yet despite this admission and recommendations from investigating Detective Ronald Schreffler to file charges, Centre County District Attorney Ray Gricker declined to prosecute, and university officials, including Athletic Director Tim Curley and Senior Vice President Gary Schultz, were informed of the allegations but took no action beyond telling Sandusky not to bring children from the Second Mile into Penn State facilities. The investigation that would eventually bring Sandusky to justice began in 2008, when a 15-year-old boy, later identified as Victim 1, reported to his high school guidance counselor that Sandusky had been sexually abusing him, leading Pennsylvania State Police and the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to launch an investigation that would eventually identify 10 victims and reveal the full scope of Sandusky's predatory behavior. The most damning evidence emerged from testimony about an incident from 2001 when graduate assistant Mike McQuarrie witnessed Sandusky anally raping a boy estimated to be about 10 years old in the showers of the Penn State football facilities late one evening. And although McQuarrie reported what he saw to head coach Joe Paterno the following day, and Paterno in turn reported it to athletic director Tim Curley and vice president Gary Schultz, no one contacted law enforcement, and the only action taken was to tell Sandusky he could no longer bring children from the Second Mile onto campus, allowing him to continue his abuse for another decade. Sandusky's pattern of abuse was remarkably consistent and calculated, with him using his position, fame, and the Second Mile organization to identify vulnerable boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 14, from troubled backgrounds, showering them with attention, gifts, trips to Penn State football games, and special privileges before gradually introducing physical contact, progressing from innocent-seeming roughhousing and back rubs to more explicit sexual touching, and ultimately, to forced oral and anal sex, often in the Penn State athletic facilities in his home or during overnight stays at hotels when traveling to football bowl games. The victims, many of whom came from difficult home situations and had no positive male role models, initially welcomed Sandusky's attention and the opportunities he provided, making them particularly vulnerable to his grooming techniques and reluctant to report the abuse due to shame, fear of not being believed, fear of losing the privileges and attention they received, and in some cases, threats from Sandusky about the consequences of disclosure. On November 5, 2011, Sandusky was arrested and charged with 40 counts of sex crimes against young boys, with the grand jury presentment detailing horrific abuse spanning from 1994 to 2009 and describing how he used his access to children through the second mile, combined with the prestige of his Penn State connections, to systematically prey on vulnerable youth while university officials who had been informed of allegations failed to protect these children. The arrest sent shockwaves through not only Penn State and the college football world, but through American society more broadly, with particular outrage directed at the institutional failures that allowed the abuse to continue for so long. And within days, Penn State's Board of Trustees fired both university president Graham Spanier and the legendary Joe Paterno, who had been head coach for 46 years and was the winningest coach in major college football history, marking a stunning fall. For an institution that had prided itself on academic integrity and doing things the right way. Sandusky's trial began on June 11, 2012, at the Center County Courthouse in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, and over the course of 8 days, the jury heard gut-wrenching testimony from 8 young men, now adults, who described in graphic detail how Sandusky had abused them when they were children, with their accounts depicting a predator who used his charm, status, and institutional connections to gain access to victims and ensure their silence. The testimony was remarkably consistent across victims who had no contact with each other, describing Sandusky's grooming process, his progression from appropriate touching to sexual abuse, his use of Penn State facilities and football program access as tools of manipulation, and the profound psychological damage they suffered, with many victims describing years of substance abuse, failed relationships, depression, and suicidal thoughts stemming from the abuse. Sandusky chose not to testify in his own defense, though his attorneys argued that he was simply a man who liked to help troubled youth and that his physical interactions with boys were misinterpreted or exaggerated, that the victims were motivated by the prospect of financial settlements, and that the prosecution was driven by media pressure and public hysteria rather than credible evidence. On June 22, 2012, after deliberating for approximately 21 hours over 2 days, the jury found Sandusky guilty on 45 of the 48 counts against him, including involuntary deviate sexual intercourse, indecent assault, unlawful contact with minors, corruption of minors, and endangering the welfare of children, convicting him of abusing 10 boys over a 15-year period. On October 9, 2012, Judge John Cleland sentenced Sandusky to 30 to 60 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the 68-year-old former coach, telling him the crime is not only what you did to their bodies but to their psyches and their souls, and the injury you did to the minds and the psychological welfare of these victims was severe and profound. Sandusky continues to maintain his innocence and has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied, and he is currently incarcerated at State Correctional Institution Laurel Highlands in Pennsylvania, where he remains in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes. The institutional failures at Penn State led to criminal charges against university officials, with former President Graham Spanier, former athletic director Tim Curley, and former Vice President Gary Schultz all eventually pleading guilty or being convicted of endangering the welfare of children for their roles in failing to report the 2001 shower incident witnessed by McQueary, though the charges of perjury and conspiracy were dropped or resulted in acquittals. The NCAA levied unprecedented sanctions against Penn State in July 2012, including a $60 million fine, a 4-year postseason ban, scholarship reductions, and the vacating of all Penn State football victories from 1998 to 2011, stripping Joe Paterno of 111 wins and his status as the winningest coach in major college football history, though some of these sanctions were later reduced or eliminated as part of settlements with the university. The Second Mile organization, irreparably damaged by the scandal and facing numerous lawsuits from Sandusky's victims, ceased operations and transferred its remaining assets to another youth charity in 2016. Penn State has paid over $100 million in settlements to Sandusky's victims, with some settlements reportedly reaching several million dollars per victim, though no amount of money can restore the childhood stolen or repair the psychological damage inflicted by years of abuse. The case fundamentally changed how institutions handle reports of child sexual abuse, leading to stronger mandatory reporting laws, enhanced training for employees who work with children, and greater accountability for administrators who fail to protect vulnerable youth, while also highlighting the dangers of institutional cultures that prioritize reputation over the safety and welfare of children. The Sandusky scandal revealed the profound harm that can occur when a predator is given unchecked access to vulnerable populations and when institutions value their image and the protection of powerful figures over the protection of children, serving as a devastating case study in the consequences of institutional failure and the importance of believing victims, investigating allegations thoroughly, and prioritizing child safety over all other considerations. For the survivors of Sandusky's abuse, the public nature of the trial and the intense media scrutiny added additional trauma to their already devastating experiences. Though many have stated that seeing their abuser convicted and imprisoned, and knowing that their courage in coming forward prevented him from harming other children, provided some measure of justice and closure, even as they continue to deal with the lasting psychological effects of the abuse they suffered at the hands of a man who was supposed to be helping them. Number 3. Wade Michael Page, the Oak Creek Sikh Temple Massacre. On August 5, 2012, Wade Michael Page, a 40-year-old white supremacist and former U.S. Army soldier with deep ties to neo-Nazi organizations and racist hate music groups, walked into the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek and opened fire on worshippers preparing for Sunday services, killing 6 people and wounding 4 others in a hate-fueled rampage that devastated the small Sikh community and highlighted the persistent threat of domestic terrorism driven by racial and religious hatred in America. Wade Michael Page had a documented history of involvement with white supremacist movements dating back to at least 2000. Having been a member of the Hammerskin Nation, one of the most violent and well-organized neo-Nazi skinhead groups in the United States, and had performed as a vocalist and bassist in several white power bands including End Apathy, Definite Hate, and Blue-Eyed Devils, groups that performed at racist music festivals and produced songs with explicitly violent, anti-Semitic, white supremacist, and anti-immigrant lyrics that advocated racial violence and genocide. Page had served in the U.S. Army from 1992 to 1998, receiving a general discharge under honorable conditions, though the circumstances of his discharge remain somewhat unclear, with Army officials later indicating that his service became problematic in his final years, possibly related to alcohol abuse and patterns of misconduct, though there was no evidence the Army was aware of his white supremacist activities while he was serving. After leaving the military, Page worked sporadically at various jobs including as a truck driver and at a Milwaukee area manufacturing plant, but devoted much of his time and energy to the white power music scene, attending racist concerts, associating with other white supremacists, and becoming increasingly radicalized in his hatred toward non-white populations, particularly targeting Muslims, Jews, and immigrants in the violent rhetoric he espoused through his music and in conversations with associates. In the months leading up to the attack, Page purchased a Springfield XD9mm semi-automatic pistol legally from a gun store in West Allis, Wisconsin, passing the required background check despite his military discharge and known associations with extremist groups, as he had no criminal record or documented mental health commitments that would have appeared in the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, highlighting a significant gap in gun regulations that fail to account for radicalization and hate group membership. On the morning of August 5, 2012, Page drove his white pickup truck to the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, a place of worship serving the local Sikh community in the Milwaukee suburb of Oak Creek, arriving around 10:30 in the morning as approximately 35 people were inside the temple preparing for their weekly Sunday prayer service and community meal, a sacred gathering known as Langar where community members come together to worship, share food, and strengthen their bonds of faith and fellowship. Page entered the parking lot and immediately began shooting, first killing Satwant Singh Kalika, the 65-year-old president of the temple who was outside greeting arriving worshippers and who attempted to tackle Page and stop the attack, fighting the gunman with a butter knife in a heroic but ultimately futile attempt to protect his community. Page then moved through the parking lot and into the temple, systematically shooting worshippers as they ran for their lives or tried to hide, killing Prakash Singh, age 39, Sita Singh, age 41, Ranjit Singh, age 49, Paramjit Kaur, age 41, and Suvig Singh Katra, age 84, the oldest victim, while severely wounding 4 others including Lieutenant Brian Murphy of the Oak Creek Police Department, who was the first officer to arrive on scene and was shot 15 times by Page while trying to help wounded victims, demonstrating extraordinary courage and dedication despite his catastrophic injuries. The attack lasted only minutes but created a scene of absolute carnage and terror, with bodies lying in the parking lot and inside the temple, survivors huddled in bathrooms and closets praying they would not be found, and the shocked Sikh community, which had never experienced such targeted violence, struggling to comprehend why they had been attacked while engaged in peaceful worship. Oak Creek police officers responded with remarkable speed and bravery, with Lieutenant Murphy surviving his wounds and other officers confronting Page in the parking lot, leading to a gun battle during which Page was shot in the stomach by Officer Sam Lenda, a tactical officer who had responded to the scene, and after being wounded, Page shot and killed himself with a gunshot to the head, ending the rampage but leaving behind a traumatized community and 6 families devastated by the loss of their loved ones. The investigation that followed, conducted by the FBI and local law enforcement, quickly established that this was an act of domestic terrorism motivated by racial and religious hatred, with investigators discovering that Page had been monitored by the Southern Poverty Law Center since 2000 due to his involvement with white supremacist groups and his participation in the neo-Nazi music scene, though he had not been under active law enforcement investigation as he had not made specific threats or engaged in illegal activities beyond his hateful rhetoric. Evidence found at Page's apartment included white supremacist literature, Nazi memorabilia, and materials indicating his deep involvement with racist ideology, while interviews with associates revealed his increasingly hostile comments about non-white populations and his frustration with what he perceived as the changing demographics of America, though investigators found no evidence of a specific manifesto or detailed planning documents that explained why he chose to target the Sikh temple on that particular day. The Sikh community, both in Oak Creek and nationally, was devastated not only by the violence itself but by the painful realization that they had been targeted due to their religious identity and appearance, with many Sikhs noting the cruel irony that they were attacked by someone who likely mistook them for Muslims, as Sikhs are often confused with Muslims by Americans unfamiliar with their distinct religion due to the turbans and beards worn by observant Sikh men, highlighting the dangers of ignorance and religious bigotry. The attack occurred against a backdrop of increased harassment and violence against Sikhs in America following September 11, 2001, with community members reporting numerous incidents of being called terrorists, having their turbans ripped off, and facing discrimination in employment and public spaces, though nothing had prepared them for the horror of a mass shooting specifically targeting their place of worship. The Oak Creek massacre prompted renewed attention to the threat of domestic terrorism from white supremacist and far-right extremist groups, with law enforcement and national security experts noting that these groups posed a significant and often underestimated danger to American communities, particularly minority religious and ethnic populations, yet often received less attention and fewer resources than international terrorist threats. The response from the Oak Creek community and the broader American public was one of overwhelming solidarity and support for the Sikh victims, with thousands attending vigils, memorial services, and fundraisers, while President Barack Obama ordered flags flown at half-staff and called the attack a senseless act of violence. Though many in the Sikh community felt that the incident did not receive the same level of sustained national attention or media coverage as other mass shootings, possibly due to unfamiliarity with the Sikh religion and the victims' immigrant backgrounds. The 6 victims were remembered not only as martyrs who died practicing their faith, but as individuals with full, rich lives. Satwant Singh Kalika was a respected community leader and small business owner who had emigrated from India in the 1980s. Prakash Singh was a priest who had recently moved to Wisconsin to serve the temple. Sita Singh worked at a motor parts manufacturer and was preparing food for the community meal when he was killed. Ranjit Singh was a devoted father and grandfather. Paramjit Kaur was a mother of two who worked at a clinic, and Suvig Singh Katra, the eldest victim, was a retired farmer and a founding member of the temple who had helped build the community from its inception. Lieutenant Brian Murphy, the Oak Creek police officer who was shot 15 times, survived his injuries through extraordinary medical intervention and his own determination, later being honored for his heroism and becoming an advocate for community policing and interfaith dialogue, though he still carries the physical and emotional scars of that day. The Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, after extensive repairs and a rededication ceremony, reopened and continues to serve the community, with leaders emphasizing their commitment to openness, peace, and their core religious principle of Chardi Kala, which means eternal optimism and moving forward despite adversity. Though the community will never forget August 5, 2012, and the 6 precious lives lost to senseless hatred. The case raised important questions about how law enforcement and intelligence agencies should monitor and respond to individuals involved with hate groups, the balance between First Amendment protections for offensive speech and the need to identify potential domestic terrorists before they act, and the adequacy of gun background check systems that fail to flag individuals with documented extremist affiliations, though no clear policy changes emerged that would definitively prevent similar attacks. For the Sikh American community nationwide, the Oak Creek massacre became a defining tragedy, spurring greater efforts at public education about Sikh religion and culture, advocacy for hate crime legislation and improved tracking of anti-Sikh incidents, and the painful recognition that even in America, a nation founded on religious freedom, they were not safe from violence motivated by bigotry and ignorance, making the 6 lives lost in Oak Creek not just a community tragedy but a national reminder of the ongoing struggle against hatred in all its forms. Number 4. Jodi Arias. The murder of Travis Alexander. The murder trial of Jodi and Arias, who brutally killed her ex-boyfriend Travis Victor Alexander in his Mesa, Arizona home on June 4, 2008, became a media sensation when it finally went to trial in 2013, but the crime itself occurred in 2012 when new evidence and testimony brought shocking revelations, though the actual murder happened in 2008, and what made this case particularly disturbing was not just the savage nature of the killing. Travis was stabbed 29 times, had his throat slashed from ear to ear so deeply that he was nearly decapitated, and was shot in the head. But Jodi's evolving explanations for what happened, her bizarre behavior before and after the murder, and the toxic, sexually charged relationship that preceded the violence, all of which captivated the public and raised questions about obsession, domestic violence, self-defense claims, and the role of sex and religion in a relationship that ended in one of the most brutal murders in recent Arizona history. Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander met in September 2006 at a business convention in Las Vegas, where both were involved with a multi-level marketing company called Prepaid Legal Services, and despite living in different states, Jodi in California and Travis in Arizona, they began a long-distance relationship with Jodi, who was raised Catholic, soon converting to Mormonism, Travis's faith, and becoming deeply involved in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, though the relationship was complicated by the conflict between their intense sexual involvement and the Mormon Church's strict teachings about chastity before marriage. The relationship became increasingly tumultuous throughout 2007, with friends of Travis describing Jodi as obsessive and possessive, hacking into his Facebook and email accounts, following him, showing up uninvited at his house and his workplace, and engaging in increasingly erratic behavior that concerned those close to Travis, who began to view her as unstable and controlling, though he continued to maintain contact with her and engage in sexual relations even after officially ending their relationship, creating a toxic dynamic that would ultimately lead to his death. After their official breakup, Jodi moved to Mesa, Arizona in 2008, allegedly to be closer to Travis despite their relationship having ended. And during this period, friends noted that Travis was trying to distance himself from Jody and was dating other women, including a new girlfriend he was becoming serious about and was planning to take on a trip to Cancun, Mexico, which seemed to trigger increasing desperation and jealousy in Jody, who could not accept that Travis was moving on with his life. On June 2, 2008, Jody rented a car in Redding, California, approximately 90 miles from her hometown of Wairika, even though rental locations were available closer to her home, and she specifically requested a white car but was given a red one, which she later claimed was problematic though she accepted it. And she removed the front license plate and turned the rear plate upside down, later explaining these actions as an attempt to avoid being tracked. Jody drove from California to Travis's house in Mesa, Arizona, arriving in the early morning hours of June 4, 2008, traveling through the night and at one point stopping to fill up 3 5-gallon gas cans she had borrowed from an ex-boyfriend, along with the car's tank, in an apparent effort to avoid using her credit card at gas stations in Arizona that might document her presence in the state. What happened next, according to the evidence presented at trial and Jody's eventual third version of events after she changed her story multiple times, was that she and Travis spent the afternoon of June 4th having sex, took nude photographs of each other in his bed using Travis's new camera, and then Travis took a shower while Jody photographed him, the last photos showing him alive in the shower at 5:29 in the afternoon. But moments later, Jody claimed that Travis became violent when she accidentally dropped his camera, and what followed was one of the most savage murders imaginable. The killing took place in Travis's bathroom and bedroom, with Jody first stabbing Travis multiple times, including defensive wounds on his hands indicating he tried to fight back and protect himself from the knife attack. Then she slashed his throat with such force that the knife cut through to his spine, nearly decapitating him, and finally she shot him in the head with a .25 caliber gun, though the exact sequence of the stabbing versus the shooting has been debated by forensic experts, with the entire attack leaving the bathroom covered in blood with smears and drag marks indicating Travis was still alive and trying to escape at various points during the assault. After killing Travis, Jody cleaned herself up, put the camera in the washing machine along with bloody towels and other evidence, placed Travis's body in his shower, and then left his house, with time-stamped photos accidentally recovered from the camera's memory card showing images taken during the struggle, including an accidental photo of the ceiling taken at 5:32, just 3 minutes after the last shower photo, a photo of Travis's body in the hallway with Jody's pant leg and foot visible, and other inadvertently captured images that would prove crucial evidence. Jody then drove from Mesa back to California, stopping to visit a man she had recently started dating in Utah as if nothing had happened, attending a prepaid legal event, kissing and being affectionate with this new romantic interest, and acting completely normal, with no one suspecting that just hours earlier she had committed a brutal murder. Travis's body was not discovered until June 9, 2008, 5 days after the murder, when concerned friends who had not heard from him and knew he had missed an important conference call and a planned trip to Cancun went to his house and found him decomposing in the shower, with the scene so horrific and the smell so overwhelming that the discovery was traumatic for those who found him. Jody was immediately a person of interest to Mesa police due to her history with Travis, the known obsessive behavior, and evidence that she had been in contact with him around the time of death, though she initially told investigators she had not been to Travis's house in months and had been nowhere near Arizona at the time of the murder, a claim quickly disproven by cell phone records, gas station receipts, and other evidence. When confronted with the evidence placing her at Travis's home, Jody changed her story, now claiming that 2 masked intruders, a man and a woman, had broken into Travis's house while she was there, killed Travis while forcing her to watch, threatened to kill her and her family if she went to the police, and then allowed her to leave, a story that investigators found completely implausible and unsupported by any physical evidence. Jody was arrested on July 15, 2008, at her grandparents' home in Wairika, California, and charged with first-degree murder, and during the investigation, she gave multiple television interviews proclaiming her innocence and alleging that whoever killed Travis should receive the death penalty, seemingly relishing the media attention while maintaining she had nothing to do with the crime. It was not until long after her arrest, and with her trial approaching, that Jody finally admitted to killing Travis but now claimed it was in self-defense, alleging that he had become violent and attacked her, that he had been physically and emotionally abusive throughout their relationship, that on the day of the murder he body-slammed her and lunged at her in anger after she dropped his camera, and that she killed him only because she feared for her life, a narrative that would become the centerpiece of her defense strategy when the case finally went to trial in January 2013. The trial, which was broadcast live and became a daily obsession for millions of viewers, featured 18 days of testimony from Jody herself, during which she described in explicit detail the sexual relationship she had with Travis, including his alleged requests for anal sex and other activities she claimed violated both of their Mormon beliefs, his alleged violent temper and controlling behavior, and her claim that on June 4, 2008, she killed him only in self-defense when he attacked her, though prosecutors systematically dismantled her credibility by highlighting her multiple contradictory statements, the absence of any corroborating evidence for her abuse claims, the lack of any defensive wounds on her body, and the forensic evidence showing the attack was sustained and brutal rather than a spontaneous self-defense response. Prosecutor Juan Martinez argued that the murder was premeditated, pointing to the rented car, the upside-down license plate, the gas cans used to avoid creating a financial trail in Arizona, the stolen gun from her grandparents' home that matched the caliber used to shoot Travis, and the sheer brutality of the attack as evidence that this was not self-defense but rather a planned killing motivated by jealousy and obsession after Travis made clear he was moving on with his life and taking another woman to Cancun. On May 8, 2013, after approximately 15 hours of deliberation, the jury found Jody Arias guilty of first-degree murder, rejecting her self-defense claims and finding that the killing was both premeditated and carried out with extreme cruelty, making her eligible for the death penalty under Arizona law. The sentencing phase proved complicated, with the jury unable to reach a unanimous decision on whether Jody should receive death or life in prison, resulting in a mistrial on that issue, and a second penalty phase jury was seated to determine her sentence. But that jury also deadlocked, and under Arizona law at the time, the decision fell to the judge who on April 13, 2015, sentenced Jody Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring she would never be released. Jody is currently incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, where she has continued to maintain her innocence in some statements while also selling artwork and giving interviews, remaining a controversial figure who some view as a domestic violence victim who killed in self-defense while the vast majority see her as a cold-blooded murderer who killed the man she claimed to love in a jealous rage, and then lied repeatedly to avoid responsibility. The case highlighted the dangers of obsessive relationships, the difficulty of prosecuting cases that involve conflicting narratives about domestic violence and self-defense, and the media's role in turning criminal trials into entertainment spectacles. While for Travis Alexander's family, the verdict provided some measure of justice, though it could never restore their beloved brother and son, a young man remembered for his motivational speaking, his devotion to his Mormon faith, his entrepreneurial spirit, and his generosity to friends and family, whose life was cut short at age 30 in a violent attack that shocked all who knew him and captivated a nation with its brutality and the disturbing psychology of the woman who killed him. Number 5. Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook Elementary School Massacre. On December 14, 2012, 20-year-old Adam Lanza murdered his mother Nancy Lanza in their Newtown, Connecticut home before driving to Sandy Hook Elementary School and carrying out one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history, killing 20 first-grade children between the ages of 6 and 7 years old and 6 adult staff members in a rampage that lasted less than 5 minutes but forever changed the national conversation about gun violence, school safety, mental health treatment, and the protection of children, leaving an indelible scar on the small New England community and the entire nation. Adam Lanza had a well-documented history of mental health issues and social difficulties dating back to his childhood, having been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and anxiety disorders, though later evaluations suggested he may have had much more severe conditions that were not properly identified or treated, and throughout his school years he struggled with sensory issues, social interaction, and communication, requiring special education services and intensive support from teachers and therapists who noted his increasing isolation and concerning behaviors. In the years leading up to the massacre, Adam became increasingly withdrawn and reclusive, spending most of his time alone in his bedroom with windows covered in black trash bags, communicating with his mother Nancy primarily through email even though they lived in the same house, becoming obsessed with mass shootings and playing violent video games for hours each day, and refusing to leave his room or interact with the outside world in what appears to have been a severe deterioration of his mental state that his mother either did not recognize or felt unable to address effectively. Nancy Lanza, a divorced mother who had dedicated herself to caring for Adam and managing his needs, was an enthusiast of firearms and frequently took Adam shooting at local gun ranges, believing it was a bonding activity they could share and possibly hoping it would help him develop confidence and skills. Though this decision to introduce weapons to someone with severe mental health issues would prove catastrophically misguided, as she kept multiple firearms in the home including a Bushmaster XM15E2S rifle, a Glock 20 SF handgun, a Sig Sauer P226 handgun, and other weapons, all legally purchased and registered to her. On the morning of December 14, 2012, Adam Lanza shot his mother 4 times in the head while she was sleeping in her bed, killing her instantly with a .22 caliber rifle, and then took her car keys, drove her black Honda Civic to Sandy Hook Elementary School where he had attended as a child, and arrived at the school around 9:30 in the morning, just after morning announcements had concluded and classes were beginning for the day. Unable to enter through the locked front doors, the school had recently implemented a security protocol requiring visitors to be buzzed in after 9:30. Lanza shot through a glass panel next to the entrance, creating a hole large enough to climb through, and entered the building armed with the Bushmaster rifle and 2 handguns, wearing black clothing, earplugs to muffle the sound of gunfire, and carrying multiple 30-round magazines. The first school staff member to encounter Lanza was Principal Dawn Hochsprung and school psychologist Mary Sherlach, who were in a meeting with other teachers when they heard the sound of breaking glass and gunfire, and they immediately ran toward the sound to investigate and protect their students, with both women being shot and killed in the hallway as they confronted the gunmen, their courage providing precious seconds for teachers in nearby classrooms to take protective action. Lanza then entered 2 first-grade classrooms, Room 8 and Room 10, where he systematically shot children and teachers with terrifying efficiency and speed, firing the Bushmaster rifle repeatedly at close range, killing 14 children and 2 staff members in Room 8 including teacher Victoria Lee Soto, who died trying to shield her students, and killing 6 children and teacher Lauren Rousseau in Room 10, while other children survived by hiding in bathrooms, playing dead among their fallen classmates or being shielded by adults who gave their lives to protect them. The entire shooting lasted approximately 5 minutes from the time Lanza entered the building until police arrived, and when he heard approaching sirens, Lanza shot himself in the head with one of the handguns, ending the rampage but leaving behind a scene of unspeakable horror with small bodies lying in pools of blood, traumatized survivors huddled in corners, and first responders who would later describe the scene as something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The 20 children killed were all 6 or 7 years old, in first grade, with their whole lives ahead of them. Charlotte Bacon, Daniel Barden, Olivia Engel, Josephine Gay, Dylan Hockley, Madeline Sue, Catherine Hubbard, Chase Kowalski, Jesse Lewis, Anna Marquez Green, James Mattioli, Grace McDonnell, Emily Parker, Jack Pinto, Noah Posner, Caroline Prevedi, Jessica Ricos, Avielle Richman, Benjamin Wheeler, and Allison Wyatt, each one a unique individual with personalities, interests, dreams, and families who love them deeply, all stolen in an act of incomprehensible violence. The 6 adult staff members who died were Dawn Hochsprung, age 47, the principal; Mary Sherlach, age 56, the school psychologist; Victoria Soto, age 27, a first-grade teacher; Lauren Rousseau, age 30, a teacher; Rachel Davino, age 29, a behavioral therapist; and Anne-Marie Murphy, age 52, a special education assistant, all of whom were remembered for their dedication to children, their bravery in the face of danger, and their ultimate sacrifice in attempting to protect the students in their care. The response to the Sandy Hook massacre was immediate and overwhelming, with President Barack Obama delivering an emotional address that evening in which he visibly struggled to maintain composure while talking about the murdered children, saying, "They had their entire lives ahead of them, birthdays, graduations, weddings, kids of their own," and the tragedy dominated news coverage for weeks as the nation grappled with the horror of small children being murdered in their classroom and the fundamental failure to protect the most innocent and vulnerable members of society. The investigation into Lanza's motive proved frustrating and incomplete, as he had destroyed his computer hard drive and left no manifesto or clear explanation for his actions. Though investigators found evidence of his obsession with mass shootings, particularly the Columbine massacre, his research into various school shootings and the weapons used, and his isolation and deteriorating mental state, but no single clear trigger or reason for why he chose that particular day or that specific school. The Connecticut office of the Child Advocate later issued a comprehensive report concluding that Lanza's mental health issues were inadequately addressed, that he had been allowed to become increasingly isolated without proper intervention, that the presence of firearms in a home with someone experiencing severe mental health deterioration was a critical risk factor that went unmanaged, and that better mental health services, family support, and threat assessment procedures might have prevented the tragedy, though they could not definitively state what would have stopped someone so determined to cause harm. Sandy Hook became a defining moment in the debate over gun control in America, with survivors' families and Newtown community members becoming passionate advocates for stronger gun laws, universal background checks, assault weapons bans, and other measures to prevent gun violence, leading to some state-level reforms in Connecticut and other jurisdictions, though efforts at federal legislation stalled in Congress despite widespread public support, creating bitter frustration among those who felt that if the murder of 21st graders could not motivate meaningful gun reform, nothing would. The tragedy also spawned a particularly cruel phenomenon of conspiracy theorists who claimed the shooting was staged or faked, harassing grieving families with accusations that their children never existed or that they were crisis actors, leading to lawsuits against conspiracy theorist Alex Jones and others who promoted these vicious lies, with courts ultimately ruling in favor of the families and awarding significant damages, though no amount of money could undo the additional trauma inflicted by having their children's deaths denied and mocked. Sandy Hook Elementary School was demolished in 2013 and a completely new school was built on the same property and opened in 2016, designed with extensive security features and meant to provide a fresh start for the community, while the original building was destroyed to prevent it from becoming a site of macabre curiosity or a monument to tragedy. The families of the victims have channeled their grief into advocacy and action, creating foundations in their children's names focused on everything from mental health awareness to school safety to gun violence prevention, ensuring that the children's brief lives have lasting meaning and impact, while also working to be remembered not primarily as victims, but as individuals who brought joy, laughter, and love to their families and communities. December 14th is now observed in Newtown and by supporters nationwide as a day of remembrance, with the phrase 26 Acts of Kindness becoming a way to honor the 26 victims killed at the school by performing acts of kindness in their memory, attempting to counter the darkness of that day with deliberate acts of light and compassion. The psychological impact on survivors, including children who witnessed the shooting or lost friends and teachers, first responders who dealt with the scene, and the broader Newtown community has been profound and lasting, with many experiencing PTSD, anxiety, depression, and complicated grief that requires ongoing support and treatment. While some survivors have become advocates themselves as they grew older, determined that their experience should drive change and prevent similar tragedies. The Sandy Hook shooting remains one of the deadliest mass shootings at an elementary school in United States history and a watershed moment in American consciousness, forcing the nation to confront the vulnerability of children in schools, the intersection of mental illness and access to weapons, the adequacy of security measures in educational settings, and the broader question of what kind of society allows such tragedies to occur with such terrible regularity. While the memory of 20 small children and 6 dedicated educators who died that December morning continues to haunt the American psyche and demand a reckoning that, more than a decade later, remains incomplete. Number 6. Drew Peterson. The conviction for murdering his third wife. In September 2012, Drew Peterson, a former police sergeant from Bolingbrook, Illinois, was convicted of murdering his third wife, Kathleen Savio, whose death in 2004 had originally been ruled an accidental drowning but was reclassified as a homicide after Peterson's fourth wife, Stacy Peterson, disappeared under suspicious circumstances in 2007, leading to one of the most closely watched trials in Illinois history and exposing a pattern of domestic abuse, manipulation, and suspected murder by a police officer who used his position and knowledge of the criminal justice system to evade accountability for years. Drew Walter Peterson had been a police officer in Bolingbrook for 29 years and was known as a swaggering, arrogant personality who had been married 4 times, with 3 of those marriages ending in divorce and the 4th ending with his wife's disappearance. And he had a history of controlling behavior, allegations of domestic violence from multiple wives, and a tendency to use his law enforcement connections and knowledge to intimidate his spouses and avoid consequences for his actions. Kathleen Savio was Peterson's third wife, and their marriage was turbulent and marked by allegations of abuse, stalking, and threats, with Savio filing for an order of protection in 2002 and documenting multiple incidents where Peterson allegedly followed her, broke into her home, and threatened her, telling her that he could make her death look like an accident, a statement that would prove chillingly prophetic. The couple's divorce was finalized in October 2003, but bitter disputes over financial settlements and property continued, with Savio scheduled to receive a significant portion of Peterson's pension and other assets, creating a powerful financial motive for Peterson to want her dead before the final property settlement was completed. On March 1, 2004, Savio was found dead in her bathtub in her Bolingbrook home, with her body discovered when Peterson, claiming concern that she was not answering her phone, sent her friend to check on her. And when that friend arrived with another neighbor, they found Savio's lifeless body in a dry bathtub with a large gash on the back of her head. The initial investigation by the Illinois State Police, conducted while Peterson was still an active-duty Bolingbrook police officer, concluded that Savio's death was an accidental drowning, theorizing that she had slipped in the tub, hit her head, and drowned, despite several suspicious circumstances including the fact that the tub was dry when her body was found, that she had a significant laceration on the back of her head inconsistent with a simple fall, that there was no water in her lungs, which would be expected in a drowning, and that she had told multiple people, including her sister and attorney, that she feared Peterson would kill her and make it look like an accident. A coroner's jury, after hearing testimony from forensic pathologists and reviewing the evidence, officially ruled Savio's death an accidental drowning, and the case was closed with Peterson never being charged, allowing him to collect on Savio's life insurance and avoid the financial obligations of the divorce settlement, while Savio's family remained convinced that she had been murdered and that Peterson had used his law enforcement connections to ensure the investigation was inadequate and the conclusion favorable to him. The case remained closed until October 28, 2007, when Drew Peterson's fourth wife, 23-year-old Stacy Ann Peterson, disappeared from their Bolingbrook home under circumstances that immediately raised suspicions, with Peterson claiming she had called him to say she was leaving him for another man and would be in touch about their children, but providing no evidence of this communication and offering constantly changing stories about the last time he saw her and what she had taken with her. The massive media attention surrounding Stacy Peterson's disappearance, the revelation of Drew Peterson's history with previous wives, and the suspicious circumstances of Kathleen Savio's death led Illinois State Police to reopen the Savio case and exhume her body for a new autopsy, which was performed in November 2007 by Dr. Larry Blum, a forensic pathologist who concluded that Savio's death was not an accident but a homicide, with her injuries consistent with being beaten and drowned by another person, reversing the original accidental death ruling and providing the basis for criminal charges. On May 7, 2009, nearly 5 years after Kathleen Savio's death, Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, though he continued to maintain his innocence and even appeared on numerous television programs mocking the investigation and portraying himself as a victim of media persecution, displaying a disturbing arrogance and apparent enjoyment of the attention that many found deeply offensive given that his wife was dead and another was missing. The prosecution's case faced significant challenges because there were no eyewitnesses to the murder, no confession, no murder weapon, and the death had occurred 8 years earlier, making physical evidence difficult to preserve and present. But prosecutors built their case on Savio's statements before her death expressing fear that Peterson would kill her. The financial motive Peterson had to prevent her from receiving the divorce settlement, the inconsistencies and suspicious circumstances surrounding the discovery of her body, and the pattern of abuse and control Peterson had demonstrated with multiple wives. The trial, which began in July 2012, became a national media spectacle with extensive coverage of Peterson's smirking courtroom demeanor, the dramatic testimony from Savio's family members and Peterson's previous wives about his controlling and violent behavior, and the controversial use of hearsay evidence allowed under a special Illinois statute known as Drew's Law that permitted certain statements made by the victim before her death to be admitted as evidence even though she was not alive. To testify, a provision that was specifically designed to address cases where the defendant was responsible for the victim's unavailability. The prosecution presented testimony from Savio's divorce attorney Harry Smith, who recounted how Kathleen had told him that Peterson threatened to kill her and make it look like an accident, from Savio's sister Susan Doman, who testified about Kathleen's fear of Peterson and her belief that he would never let her go, and from several of Peterson's former girlfriends and ex-wives who described his controlling behavior, his tendency to monitor their movements and communications, and his implied threats about what would happen if they tried to leave him. The defense argued that Savio's death was indeed accidental, that the original investigation and coroner's jury had reached the correct conclusion, that the case was only being prosecuted because of media pressure and public hysteria surrounding Stacy Peterson's disappearance, and that the hearsay evidence should not be admitted because it denied Peterson his constitutional right to confront the witnesses against him, though these arguments were ultimately rejected by the court. On September 6, 2012, after deliberating for nearly 14 hours, the jury found Drew Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio, with jurors later indicating that they found the circumstantial evidence compelling, particularly the combination of Savio's statements about fearing Peterson, the financial motive, the suspicious circumstances of the death, and the pattern of behavior with other women that suggested Peterson was capable of violence when his control was threatened. On February 21, 2013, Judge Edward Burmala sentenced Peterson to 38 years in prison, stating that the murder was committed in an exceptionally brutal and heinous manner indicative of wanton cruelty, and that Peterson had shown no remorse and had in fact mocked the victim's family and the judicial process, making him undeserving of leniency. Peterson's conviction was appealed on multiple grounds, primarily challenging the admission of hearsay evidence under Drew's law as a violation of his Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses. But in 2017, the Illinois Appellate Court unannulled the conviction, and in 2019, the Illinois Supreme Court also upheld it, finding that while the hearsay statute was a close constitutional question, it was ultimately permissible given the special circumstances of the case. While serving his sentence for Kathleen Savio's murder, Drew Peterson was additionally charged in 2015 with solicitation of murder for hire and solicitation to commit murder after prosecutors alleged that he had attempted to hire a fellow inmate at the Menard Correctional Center to kill Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow, who had prosecuted him, with Peterson allegedly offering a cell phone and money in exchange for having Glasgow killed. And in 2016, Peterson was convicted of these charges and received an additional 40 years in prison to run consecutively with his murder sentence, ensuring he will likely die in prison. Drew Peterson is currently incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Indiana, where he continues to maintain his innocence regarding Kathleen Savio's murder while showing no apparent remorse or acknowledgement of responsibility, and he continues to be the primary suspect in the disappearance of Stacy Peterson, though her body has never been found and no charges have been filed in that case despite extensive searches and investigation. The Peterson case highlighted several critical issues in domestic violence and homicide prosecution, including the importance of taking seriously victim statements about fearing their partners, the ways that perpetrators with law enforcement training can manipulate investigations, the need for thorough and independent death investigations even when circumstances initially appear accidental, and the legal and constitutional challenges of prosecuting cases where the defendant may have caused the unavailability of key witnesses. For Kathleen Savio's family, the conviction brought some measure of justice after years of believing she had been murdered and seeing her killer walk free, though it came at the cost of having to relive her death and her fears through public trial testimony and media coverage. And they continue to remember Kathleen not as a murder victim but as a devoted mother to her two sons, a woman who loved life and her family, and someone who deserved to live free from fear and violence. The case also served as a stark reminder that positions of authority and public trust, such as law enforcement, do not immunize individuals from being perpetrators of domestic violence and murder, and that thorough, independent investigations are essential even when, or perhaps especially when, the suspect is a police officer or other person with connections to the criminal justice system. Number 7. James E. Holmes. The Colorado theater shooting, continued impact and trial preparation. While the actual Aurora theater shooting occurred on July 20, 2012, as detailed in our first case, the year 2012 was also marked by the ongoing investigation, the disturbing revelations about the extent of Holmes's planning, the legal battles over his mental health evaluation, and the community's struggle to process the tragedy, with prosecutors working to build their case for trial while defense attorneys sought psychiatric evaluations that would support an insanity defense, creating a legal and psychological drama that would extend for years beyond the actual shooting. Throughout the latter half of 2012, investigators continued to uncover the scope of Holmes's preparation for the massacre, discovering that he had been planning the attack for months, had conducted extensive research on previous mass shootings, had studied the layouts of several theaters before selecting the Century 16 location, had experimented with explosive materials and timing devices in his apartment, and had created detailed diagrams and calculations about how to maximize casualties, all documented in his notebook that he had mailed to his psychiatrist at the University of Colorado. The notebook, which became a crucial piece of evidence in understanding Holmes's state of mind, contained disturbing entries that mixed scientific calculations about kill rates and ammunition capacity with rambling philosophical musings about the meaning of human life, the nature of evil, and Holmes's own internal struggles, with some pages showing organized, coherent thinking while others descended into fragmented thoughts and obsessive repetition, providing a window into a deeply troubled mind that defense attorneys would argue was psychotic while prosecutors would contend showed rational planning and awareness of his actions. Legal battles erupted almost immediately over whether the notebook and Holmes's communications with his psychiatrist, Dr. Lynn Fenton, were protected by doctor-patient confidentiality or were admissible as evidence, with the defense arguing that the therapeutic relationship meant these materials should be privileged, while prosecutors contended that Holmes had waived that privilege and that the materials were essential to understanding his mental state and motive, with courts ultimately ruling that much of the material would be admissible, though certain purely therapeutic communications would remain protected. The question of Holmes's sanity became the central issue in the case, with the defense acknowledging that Holmes had committed the shooting but arguing that he was legally insane at the time, suffering from schizophrenia and unable to distinguish right from wrong, while prosecutors prepared to argue that Holmes's elaborate planning, his lucid interactions with law enforcement after the shooting, his awareness of the consequences of his actions, and his ability to execute a complex plan all demonstrated that he was sane under Colorado law, setting up a battle of psychiatric experts that would ultimately determine whether Holmes faced the death penalty or life in a mental health facility. Holmes underwent extensive psychiatric evaluation in late 2012 and into 2013, with court-appointed mental health experts spending hundreds of hours interviewing him, reviewing his history, administering psychological tests, and attempting to determine whether he met the legal criteria for insanity, with these evaluations revealing his long history of social isolation, his struggles with depression and anxiety, his decline during graduate school, and his own later claims that he had been experiencing psychotic symptoms including command hallucinations telling him to kill, though the reliability of his self-reporting was questioned given his motive to appear insane. The community of Aurora struggled throughout 2012 to heal from the trauma, with survivors dealing with physical injuries that ranged from minor to life-altering, including paralysis, brain damage, and permanent disabilities, while those who were physically unharmed often suffered from severe PTSD, depression, anxiety, and survivor's guilt, questioning why they lived while others died and struggling to process the random violence that had shattered their sense of safety. Vigils and memorial services were held throughout the summer and fall of 2012, with thousands gathering to honor the victims, support the survivors, and attempt to make sense of the senseless, while the city installed a permanent memorial with 12 crosses representing each victim killed, later replaced with a more permanent structure that would honor their memories while providing a place for reflection and healing. The victims' families faced the agonizing process of burying their loved ones while also preparing for the long legal battle ahead, knowing that the trial could take years and would require them to relive the horror of that night repeatedly through testimony, evidence presentation, and media coverage, creating a prolonged trauma that many described as almost unbearable but necessary to ensure justice was served. Political and policy debates intensified throughout 2012 in the wake of the shooting, with advocates for gun control pointing to Holmes's ability to legally purchase an arsenal of weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition with no red flags or waiting periods as evidence of the need for stronger regulations, while gun rights advocates argued that the shooting demonstrated the need for armed citizens to defend themselves and that additional laws would not have prevented a determined killer, creating a familiar polarized debate that produced little concrete action at the federal level. Questions were also raised about the responsibility of the University of Colorado and Holmes's psychiatrist for failing to prevent the attack, with some arguing that more aggressive intervention was needed when Holmes exhibited clear warning signs and discussed violent fantasies, while others pointed out the limits of what mental health professionals can legally do without specific, credible threats and the difficulty of predicting which troubled individuals will actually act on violent thoughts versus the many who never do. The Century 16 Theater remained closed throughout late 2012 as the owner's Cinemark grappled with how to reopen a site of such tragedy, ultimately deciding to renovate Theater 9 completely, changing the layout, the seat numbers, and the overall appearance to make it distinct from the location where the shooting occurred, while also implementing enhanced security measures and offering the theater space for community events before reopening to the public. Some survivors and victims' families criticized Cinemark for not doing enough to provide security that night, noting the lack of alarms on emergency exits that allowed Holmes to prop open the door and re-enter, and several filed lawsuits against the theater chain arguing they had been negligent in their security measures. Though these suits faced legal challenges and mixed results in court, the impact on first responders who dealt with the scene was profound and often overlooked in initial coverage, with police officers, firefighters, and emergency medical personnel describing the horror of entering the theater and finding victims ranging from small children to elderly adults, some already dead and others crying out for help, with the triage decisions and the emotional weight of that night leading to PTSD and mental health struggles among many responders, some of whom left their professions as a result. Throughout 2012, Holmes remained in custody at the Arapahoe County Jail under special restrictions due to both security concerns and suicide risk, held in isolation and monitored constantly, making few public appearances and showing little emotion when he did appear in court. His behavior fueling continued debate about whether he was severely mentally ill, deliberately acting to appear insane, or some combination of both. The prosecution team spent the remainder of 2012 building an overwhelming case with thousands of pieces of evidence, hundreds of witness statements, extensive forensic analysis, and expert testimony, preparing for what they knew would be one of the most challenging and important trials in Colorado history, while also managing the emotional toll of working daily with such horrific material and the weight of representing the victims and the community's demand for justice. As 2012 drew to a close, Aurora remained a community in trauma, grappling with the reality that their city would forever be associated with one of America's deadliest mass shootings, that 12 families would face their first holidays without their loved ones, that survivors would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, and that the path to any kind of justice or closure would be long, painful, and incomplete. Yet amid this darkness, there were also stories of remarkable courage, compassion, and resilience, with neighbors supporting neighbors, strangers donating to victim funds, and a community determination that they would not be defined solely by the evil that had visited them, but by how they responded to it with kindness, unity, and a commitment to honoring those who were lost by building a stronger, more connected community in their memory. Number 8. Ariel Castro. The Cleveland Kidnapping Discovery and Charges. On May 6, 2013, Amanda Berry, one of 3 women who had been held captive in a Cleveland house for nearly a decade, escaped and called 911, leading to the discovery of one of the most horrifying kidnapping and sexual abuse cases in modern American history. Though the crimes themselves occurred throughout 2012 and the years prior, when Ariel Castro held Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina De Jesus prisoner in his home on Seymour Avenue, subjecting them to repeated rape, torture, starvation, and psychological abuse while he maintained an outwardly normal life as a school bus driver and musician in the community. Ariel Castro was a 52-year-old former school bus driver who had grown up in the same Cleveland neighborhood where he would later commit his crimes, and he had a documented history of domestic violence against his former wife Grimilda Figueroa, who had obtained a protective order against him in 1993 after he repeatedly beat her, broke her nose, fractured her ribs, and caused injuries that left her with permanent damage including facial paralysis and a blood clot on her brain. Though he was never prosecuted for the most serious assaults and was allowed to maintain contact with his children despite the abuse. Castro's first victim was Michelle Knight, who was 21 years old when she was kidnapped on August 23, 2002, after Castro offered her a ride when she was walking to a social services appointment related to her young son. And once she was in his vehicle, he drove her to his house on Seymour Avenue, lured her inside with a promise of giving her a puppy for her son, and then attacked her, binding her with chains in a dark basement room where she would remain imprisoned for the next 11 years. Amanda Berry was 16 years old when Castro abducted her on April 21, 2003, the day before her 17th birthday, approaching her as she left her job at a Burger King and offering her a ride home, claiming he was the father of one of her friends, and once she was in his car, he drove her to his house and forced her into the basement where Michelle Knight was already being held, beginning years of captivity during which she would be raped repeatedly and would eventually give birth to Castro's daughter while in captivity. Gina De Jesus was 14 years old when Castro, who was actually the father of her friend Arlene Castro, kidnapped her on April 2, 2004, as she was walking home from school, offering her a ride and telling her that his daughter Arlene was at his house and wanted to see her, and when she got into his car and they arrived at his home, he forced her into the house and down to the basement where Michelle and Amanda were being held, completing his collection of captives whom he would torture for years. The conditions Castro subjected these women to were beyond comprehension, with them being chained to walls in dark basement rooms, denied adequate food and water, forced to use a bucket as a toilet, beaten with barbells and other objects, raped repeatedly and sometimes multiple times a day, impregnated through the rapes and then beaten to induce miscarriages, with at least 5 pregnancies being terminated through Castro's violence, kept in isolation from each other for extended periods, and psychologically tormented with threats that if they tried to escape or disobeyed his rules, he would kill them and their families, creating an atmosphere of total terror and control. Castro would occasionally move the women to different rooms in the house as years went on, sometimes keeping them in upstairs bedrooms but always secured with chains, locks, and boarded-up windows, and he maintained elaborate security measures including locks on all doors that only he had keys to, alarm systems, and a constant state of vigilance that made escape seem impossible, while simultaneously he would leave the house to go to work as a school bus driver, play bass in local bands, and visit his family, presenting himself as a normal member of the community with no one suspecting the horrors occurring in his home. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical abuse, with Castro playing mind games, forcing the women to watch news coverage of their families desperately searching for them, telling them that they had been forgotten and no one was looking anymore, sometimes pretending he was going to release them only to laugh and tell them he was joking, and maintaining absolute control over every aspect of their lives, including what they ate, when they could use the bathroom, and whether they were kept in darkness or allowed any light. Amanda Berry became pregnant by Castro in 2006 and gave birth to a daughter on December 25, 2006, in a plastic kiddie pool in the house with no medical attention, attended only by Michelle Knight, whom Castro forced to assist with the delivery under threat of death if the baby did not survive. And remarkably, both Amanda and the baby survived despite the horrific conditions, with the child, named Jocelyn, growing up as a prisoner alongside her mother for the first 6 years of her life. The women developed various survival strategies over the years, sometimes bonding with each other when Castro allowed them contact, creating makeshift ways to communicate through walls and vents, trying to maintain hope by marking time and remembering their families, and looking for any opportunity to escape, though Castro's security measures and threats made such opportunities vanishingly rare. The break that led to their freedom came on May 6, 2013, when Castro made the mistake of leaving the house without securing all the locks as thoroughly as usual, and Amanda Berry, hearing the front door and realizing Castro had left, began screaming for help and managed to partially open the locked front door, attracting the attention of neighbors Charles Ramsey and Angel Cordero, who helped her kick through the bottom of the storm door, allowing her and her 6-year-old daughter to escape, after which she immediately called 911 and told the dispatcher, "Help me. I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here. I'm free now," leading to immediate police response. Police arrived within minutes and entered Castro's house, where they found Michelle Knight and Gina De Jesus still chained in upstairs bedrooms, malnourished, terrified, and barely able to believe they were actually being rescued after years of captivity. And the 3 women were taken to Metro Health Medical Center for evaluation and treatment, while police secured the house as a crime scene and immediately began searching for Ariel Castro. Castro was arrested a short time later at a McDonald's restaurant near his home, and when questioned by police, He initially claimed he didn't know what they were talking about before eventually admitting, "I knew I was going to get caught someday," and providing a confession in which he attempted to minimize his actions and claim that the women were not forced but rather stayed willingly, an absurd claim contradicted by all evidence and testimony. The case shocked the Cleveland community and the nation, with people struggling to comprehend how 3 young women could be held captive for approximately 11, 10, and 9 years respectively in a residential neighborhood without anyone discovering them, leading to intense scrutiny of missed opportunities where police had been called to the house for various minor incidents but never conducted searches that would have discovered the victims. Castro was charged with 977 counts including aggravated murder for the forced miscarriages, kidnapping, rape, and aggravated burglary, making him potentially eligible for the death penalty, and prosecutors made clear they would seek the most severe punishment possible for what they characterized as some of the most depraved crimes they had ever encountered. Rather than face trial, Castro accepted a plea bargain in July 2013, in which he pleaded guilty to 937 counts in exchange for prosecutors dropping the death penalty, and he was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years without possibility of parole, ensuring he would never be free again. At his sentencing hearing, Castro showed no real remorse and instead tried to justify his actions, claiming he was addicted to sex and pornography, that the women were treated well and lived a normal life in his house, and that the sex was consensual, statements that horrified everyone present and demonstrated his complete lack of insight into the magnitude of his crimes. Before Michelle Knight delivered a powerful victim impact statement in which she told Castro, "You took 11 years of my life away. I spent 11 years in hell. Now your hell is just beginning," and reclaimed her power by stating she would not let him destroy her. Castro was incarcerated at the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio, where he was placed in protective custody and under suicide watch given the nature of his crimes and the risk of violence from other inmates. But on September 3, 2013, just 1 month into his sentence, he was found hanged in his cell in an apparent suicide, though some questions remained about whether it was truly suicide or possibly accidental death during autoerotic asphyxiation given the specific circumstances. But, regardless, his death meant he would never serve the full sentence and never face the daily consequences of his actions. The 3 survivors faced the difficult task of reintegrating into a world that had changed dramatically during their captivity, with Michelle Knight, who later legally changed her name to Lily Rose Lee to reclaim her identity, Amanda Berry, and Gina De Jesus all working to rebuild their lives, reconnect with their families, and process the trauma of their years in. Number 9. John McAfee, wanted for murder in Belize. In November 2012, software pioneer and antivirus software creator John McAfee became an international fugitive when Belizean authorities named him as a person of interest in the murder of his neighbor Gregory Fall, who was found dead with a gunshot wound to the head in his home on the island of Ambergris Caye, Belize, leading to a bizarre international manhunt, McAfee's claims of persecution by corrupt Belizean officials, and a media spectacle that highlighted the eccentric millionaire's paranoia, reckless behavior, and the dark turn his life had taken in the years since selling his software company and moving to Central America. John David McAfee had founded McAfee Associates in 1987, creating one of the first commercial antivirus software programs and building it into a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars before selling his stake in the mid-1990s and embarking on a series of increasingly erratic ventures including yoga instruction, light sport aircraft development, and eventually settling in Belize in 2008, where he purchased property on Ambergris Caye and claimed to be developing antibiotics from jungle plants, though his activities there became increasingly controversial and alarming to neighbors and authorities. By 2012, McAfee's behavior in Belize had become increasingly bizarre and concerning, with him surrounding himself with armed guards, maintaining a harem of young local women who lived with him at his compound, allegedly using and distributing methamphetamine and other drugs, conducting strange scientific experiments that neighbors complained created foul odors, and becoming paranoid about the Belizean government and local police whom he accused of being corrupt and targeting him, claims that authorities dismissed as the delusions of a drug user and troublemaker. McAfee's relationship with his neighbor Gregory Fall, an American expatriate and retired property developer, was contentious and had deteriorated over disputes about McAfee's dogs, which Fall complained were aggressive and a nuisance, and in April 2012, 4 of McAfee's dogs were found poisoned to death, an incident McAfee immediately blamed on Fall, though there was no evidence to support this accusation, and McAfee publicly stated his anger about the dogs and his belief that Fall was responsible, creating an obvious motive when Fall turned up dead months later. On November 11, 2012, Gregory Fall, age 54, was found dead in his home with a single gunshot wound to the back of his head in what appeared to be an execution-style killing, and given the known disputes between Fall and McAfee, along with McAfee's armed guards and history of erratic behavior, police immediately wanted to question McAfee as a person of interest in the investigation, though they emphasized he was not formally a suspect and they simply needed to speak with him about his neighbor's death. McAfee, however, refused to speak with police and instead went into hiding, later claiming that he feared corrupt Belizean authorities would kill him if he turned himself in, that the murder was either committed by government agents trying to frame him or by someone else entirely and the investigation was being manipulated to target him, and that his only option was to flee the country, launching a weeks-long period where McAfee claimed to be hiding in the jungle and evading authorities while simultaneously giving interviews to media outlets and posting on his blog about his adventures. The spectacle that followed was surreal, with McAfee conducting phone interviews with news organizations while claiming to be on the run, hiring a film crew to document his fugitive status, posting photos and updates on social media that appeared to show him in various locations across Belize, and generally behaving more like someone seeking publicity than someone genuinely trying to avoid capture, leading many to question whether his claimed fear was legitimate or whether this was an elaborate, attention-seeking stunt by a man who enjoyed being in the spotlight and stirring up controversy. During his time as a fugitive, McAfee gave an in-person interview to Vice magazine reporters who tracked him down at a supposed hiding location, and in one of the most infamous moments of the saga, the photo Vice published with the interview contained metadata showing the exact GPS coordinates where it was taken, potentially revealing McAfee's location to authorities, though he apparently moved before they could act on the information, an error that McAfee later claimed was intentional. Misdirection, though this seemed unlikely. Belizean authorities maintained that they simply wanted to question McAfee, and that his refusal to cooperate was making him look guilty and obstructing their investigation into Fall's death, with officials becoming increasingly frustrated by McAfee's media circus and his international claims that Belize was a corrupt narco-state where he could not receive fair treatment, accusations that damaged the country's reputation and tourist industry. On December 5, 2012, McAfee crossed the border into Guatemala and was detained by Guatemalan immigration authorities for entering the country illegally, and he immediately requested political asylum, claiming he was fleeing persecution in Belize and feared for his life if returned there, though Guatemalan authorities were skeptical of his claims and began deportation proceedings to send him back to Belize to face questioning. While detained in Guatemala, McAfee was hospitalized twice, once claiming he was suffering a heart attack, though doctors found no evidence of cardiac issues, leading to speculation that he was feigning illness to delay deportation, and his erratic behavior continued with him giving rambling interviews, posting bizarre messages online, and generally appearing to be either genuinely mentally unstable or deliberately acting the part to generate sympathy and media coverage. Rather than deport him to Belize as initially planned, Guatemalan authorities ultimately decided to deport McAfee to the United States instead, where he arrived in Miami on December 12, 2012, ending his time as a fugitive but not ending the controversy surrounding him or the unanswered questions about Gregory Fall's murder. Belizean authorities stated that they still wanted to question McAfee about Fall's death, but with him now in the United States, they had limited ability to compel his cooperation, and no extradition request was ever filed, leaving the investigation into Fall's murder effectively stalled and the case remaining officially unsolved, though suspicion continued to focus on McAfee despite the lack of charges. McAfee continued to maintain his innocence regarding Fall's death, claiming he had nothing to do with the murder and that he had been set up by corrupt Belizean officials who wanted to steal his property and destroy him, though he provided no convincing evidence to support these conspiracy theories, and his credibility was severely undermined by his history of drug use, paranoid statements, and attention-seeking behavior. After returning to the United States, McAfee attempted to rebuild his public image and business ventures, running a brief and unsuccessful campaign for the Libertarian Party's presidential nomination in 2016, starting new cybersecurity companies, and continuing to give media interviews where he discussed his adventures in Belize and promoted various conspiracy theories about government surveillance, cryptocurrency, and technology, positioning himself as a maverick freedom fighter, though many saw him as simply a troubled and reckless individual whose wealth had allowed him to avoid consequences for destructive behavior. The Gregory Fall murder remains officially unsolved, with Belizean police maintaining that McAfee was never formally charged because there was insufficient evidence to prove his involvement beyond establishing motive and opportunity, though they have never identified any alternative suspects or made any arrests in the case, leaving Fall's family without justice and the circumstances of his death shrouded in mystery and speculation. In 2019, McAfee was indicted by the United States federal government on tax evasion charges for failing to file tax returns for multiple years despite earning millions from consulting work, cryptocurrency promotions, and speaking engagements, with prosecutors alleging he had been deliberately hiding his income and assets to avoid paying taxes, charges that McAfee claimed were politically motivated retaliation for his criticisms of government surveillance and his promotion of cryptocurrency. McAfee fled the United States again in 2019 to avoid the tax charges, traveling through multiple countries before eventually being arrested in Spain in October 2020 at Barcelona's International Airport as he attempted to board a flight to Istanbul. And he was detained in a Spanish prison while the United States sought his extradition to face the tax charges, which carried potential prison time if he was convicted. On June 23, 2021, Spanish authorities approved McAfee's extradition to the United States, and just hours after that decision was announced, John McAfee, age 75, was found dead in his cell at the Bryans II prison near Barcelona in an apparent suicide by hanging, though his death immediately sparked conspiracy theories given his previous statements that he would never kill himself and his claims that powerful entities wanted him silenced, though official investigations concluded his death was indeed suicide and found no evidence of foul play. The circumstances surrounding McAfee's later years, his 2012 fugitive episode in Belize, and the unresolved murder of Gregory Fall paint a portrait of a brilliant but deeply troubled man whose early success with antivirus software gave him wealth and freedom. Number 10. The Etten Patz murder case. Pedro Hernandez's confession. In May 2012, the decades-old mystery of 6-year-old Etten Patz's disappearance took a dramatic turn when Pedro Hernandez, a 51-year-old man living in New Jersey, confessed to strangling the boy in 1979, providing a shocking potential resolution to one of the most famous missing children cases in American history, and one that had helped launch the modern missing children's movement. Though Hernandez's confession also raised troubling questions about false confessions, mental illness, and whether justice could truly be served more than 3 decades after a crime when memories had faded, evidence had been lost, and the case had become as much about symbol as about solving an actual murder. Etten Khalil Patz was 6 years old when he disappeared on May 25, 1979, in the Soho neighborhood of Manhattan, New York City, after his mother allowed him for the first time to walk alone to his school bus stop 2 blocks from their apartment. A journey that should have taken just a few minutes but from which Etten never returned, vanishing without a trace and triggering one of the most extensive missing child searches in New York history. The case became a national symbol of missing children, with Etten's photo appearing on milk cartons beginning in 1984, as part of an innovative awareness campaign. May 25th being designated as National Missing Children's Day by President Ronald Reagan, and Etton's disappearance helping to catalyze the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, making him not just a victim but an emblem of every parent's worst nightmare and the face of child safety advocacy in America. The investigation into Etton's disappearance spanned decades and initially focused on Jose Ramos, a convicted child molester who had been dating a woman who sometimes babysat Etton and who was known to have been in the area when the boy disappeared, and Ramos was considered the prime suspect for years, even being declared responsible for Etton's death in a 2004 civil lawsuit filed by Etton's parents, though he never confessed and there was never sufficient evidence to charge him criminally. And he was eventually imprisoned for other child abuse offenses while maintaining he had nothing to do with Etton's disappearance. The case remained frustratingly unsolved despite massive publicity and investigative efforts, with Etton's parents Stan and Julie Patz becoming advocates for missing children while never knowing what happened to their son, maintaining their Soho apartment at the same location hoping Etton might somehow find his way home, and marking each anniversary of his disappearance with renewed pleas for information, their unresolved grief becoming a public symbol of the permanent wound left by a missing child. In April 2012, investigators received new information that led them to search a basement on Prince Street in Soho, very close to where Etton had disappeared, based on a tip that the location might contain Etton's remains. And they conducted an extensive excavation of the site, jackhammering through concrete and sifting through tons of dirt and debris, but ultimately found no evidence linking the location to Etton's disappearance, though the renewed search brought the case back into national headlines and apparently prompted someone with knowledge of the case to come forward. On May 24, 2012, the day before the 33rd anniversary of Etton's disappearance, Pedro Hernandez walked into a police station in Camden, New Jersey, and told his brother-in-law, who then contacted authorities, that he had been involved in the disappearance and wanted to confess, leading to his arrest and a confession in which he claimed that in 1979, when he was an 18-year-old stock clerk at a convenience store on the route Etton walked to his bus stop, he had lured the boy into the basement of the store with the promise of a soda, choked him to death, and then placed his body in a bag and deposited it with garbage that would have been collected and taken to a landfill, destroying any physical evidence. Hernandez's confession was detailed and appeared to include information about Etton's appearance and the circumstances of the disappearance that seemed to corroborate his story, and he was charged with second-degree murder based on this confession, though prosecutors and investigators immediately faced significant challenges in building a case beyond the confession itself. The reliability of Hernandez's confession became the central issue in the case, as it emerged that he had a long history of mental illness, including diagnoses of schizophrenia and psychotic disorder with hallucinations and delusions, had a documented history of making false statements and confessions to family members about various incidents, scored extremely low on IQ tests suggesting developmental disabilities, and had reportedly told people over the years that he had done something bad to a child in New York, though the specifics of these statements varied and some family members believed he was delusional rather than actually confessing to a real crime. Defense attorneys argued that Hernandez's confession was the product of his mental illness, that he had a tendency to confabulate and believe things that were not true, that he may have inserted himself into the famous Etton Patz case because of the renewed publicity in 2012 and his own need for attention or punishment driven by his psychological issues, and that without any physical evidence, DNA, witnesses, or corroboration beyond his own unreliable statements, the confession should not be trusted. Prosecutors countered that while Hernandez did have mental health issues, he was able to provide specific details about the crime scene, Etton's appearance, and the circumstances that someone fabricating a story would not know, that his confession remained consistent in its core elements across multiple interviews, that his behavior in the decades since, including leaving New York and expressing guilt to family members, was consistent with someone who had committed a terrible crime, and that the confession should be taken seriously despite the challenges it presented. The case highlighted the complex issue of false confessions and how mental illness, intellectual disabilities, suggestive interrogation techniques, and a desire for attention or resolution of guilt can lead innocent people to confess to crimes they did not commit, a phenomenon that has been documented in numerous cases and that raises serious questions about the reliability of confessions as the sole basis for prosecution. Hernandez's first trial began in October 2014 and lasted 3 months, featuring his videotaped confession, testimony from family members about his mental state and previous statements, expert witnesses debating his competency and the reliability of his confession, and emotional testimony from Stan and Julie Patz about their son's disappearance and the decades of not knowing what happened to him. But after 18 days of deliberation, the jury was hopelessly deadlocked with 11 jurors voting guilty and 1 holdout voting not guilty, resulting in a mistrial. A second trial was held in 2017, and this time, after 9 days of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Hernandez guilty of murder and kidnapping, apparently convinced that despite his mental health issues, his confession was credible and that he had indeed killed Etten Patz in 1979, bringing a measure of closure to a case that had haunted New York and the nation for nearly 4 decades. In April 2017, Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with the judge acknowledging the unusual circumstances of the case, including the passage of time and Hernandez's mental health issues, but finding that justice required him to be held accountable for taking Etten's life. And Hernandez is currently serving his sentence at a New York State prison. For Stan and Julie Patz, the conviction provided an answer to the question that had consumed their lives for 38 years, confirming that Etten was indeed dead and had not run away or been taken to live somewhere else, giving them a form of closure, though nothing could ever truly heal the wound of losing their child or restore the decades they spent not knowing. And they have stated that while the conviction does not bring Etten back, it honors his memory and allows them to finally know the truth. The case remains controversial among some legal experts and advocates against wrongful convictions, who argue that convicting someone based solely on a confession from a mentally ill individual with no physical evidence sets a dangerous precedent, and that there remains reasonable doubt about whether Hernandez actually committed the crime or falsely confessed due to his psychological issues, though prosecutors and the juries who heard the evidence clearly believed his confession was credible. The resolution of the Etten Patz case in 2012 with Hernandez's confession and subsequent conviction represents both an ending and a continuation, closing a chapter on one of America's most famous missing children cases while also highlighting the ongoing challenges of cold case investigations, the complexities of mental health in the criminal justice system, and the question of whether justice delayed by decades can truly be justice at all, particularly when the person convicted may themselves be a victim of their own impaired mind and the primary evidence is their own words rather than objective proof of their actions. For the missing children's advocacy movement that Etten's disappearance helped create, his case remains a touchstone reminder of why the work continues, why every missing child deserves the same attention and resources that Etten received, and why families like the Patzes should never have to endure decades of not knowing what happened to Th.